Okay, so in this lecture, we're going to talk about ethical relativism and look at a couple of arguments in favor of this view. First, ethical relativism is the view that moral truths depend on what we believe or what we value. In a certain way, this has a similarity to divine command theory, in that it says that morality depends on what someone thinks, but with divine command theory, it's about what God thinks. With ethical relativism, it's about what people think. There are two versions of ethical relativism. The first version is called cultural ethical relativism. This is the view that morality depends on values accepted by a society. So, whatever the group says is right, that determines what is morally right for people in that group. The other version is personal ethical relativism. This is the view that morality depends on values accepted by the individual. So the idea here is that each of us is individually creating morality for ourselves, and so what's right for you may be wrong for me, and vice versa. One kind of argument in favor of ethical relativism is what James Rachels calls the cultural differences argument, or sometimes it's called the argument from disagreement. So here's one way of formulating this argument. We start with the idea that if there are objective moral truths, then different societies should arrive at the same moral codes. The second premise is that different societies have different moral codes, and Rachel discusses some examples. For example, the Colossians having the practice of eating their dead versus the Greeks having the practice of burning their dead. And so then the conclusion that follows is that there are no objective moral truths. So the way I've laid it out here, it's a deductively valid argument. So the question is it a sound argument? Are the premises true? Here are a couple of objections. One reply is that, well, in fact, there is a great deal of widespread moral agreement, that we can find a lot of things that are nearly universal across different societies. Rachel's gives some examples, like, for example, every society that has ever existed has had some kind of prohibition on murder, and prohibitions on stealing, and prohibitions on rape, and also another rule that's very common across societies is some version of the golden rule, like you should treat others the way you would like to be treated. Rachel's argues that there are some good reasons for these rules to be universal. Basically, that any society that didn't have rules like these could not continue to exist in the long term. Whether that's true or not, though, it does seem that you can argue that there are some basic rules that are nearly universal. The second point is that actually there can be widespread, deep, persistent disagreement about objective truths. So the point here is that even if there were no moral agreement across societies, that wouldn't show that there was no moral truths, no objective moral truths, because we can disagree about objective things all the time. We do this in other areas like economics, like science. People used to disagree about whether the earth was round or flat. That didn't mean that there was no objective truth of the matter. And some sources of disagreement in ethics might have similar roots. A lot of our disagreements might just boil down to empirical disagreements about the observable world or about the scientific world and the way the world works, just like we disagreed about whether the earth was round or flat. So, for example, one of the big moral disagreements that we have is whether we should have a progressive tax policy or whether we should have a more flat tax policy. And this is a big moral disagreement. We debate this in politics. This drives a lot of heated discussion. This determines and often in many cases, who we vote for. But ultimately, a lot of this disagreement is just about which theory of economics is the correct one. We have basically the same moral goal, at least most of us. We want to create a thriving society that is good for everyone. We just disagree about which way is the best way to get there. Sometimes moral disagreements can come down to metaphysical disagreements. For example, it might come down to different religious views. So, to take just a hypothetical example, imagine a tribe which believes that there is a volcano god who will destroy the entire world unless we throw a virgin into the volcano. So, the moral principle they're acting on is that they need to sacrifice one person in order to save the entire world. That's a moral principle we can understand. So actually, we share the same moral view. Where we differ from them is on the metaphysical view. We don't share their view that there's a volcano god who is going to destroy the world. So some things that look like moral disagreements can just boil down to these kinds of empirical disagreements. A lot of times, what can drive moral disagreements is self deception or selfishness. And of course, this drives disagreements in other objective domains too. So, very often, we believe what we want to be true, and sometimes we ignore the evidence, or we ignore the principles, or we contradict ourselves even because of what we want to believe to be true. This can happen in economics. A lot of people are inclined to favor the economic theory that is going to benefit people like them. This happens for other political issues. This happens for all kinds of issues, and it can happen in ethics as well. So this can be another explanation for why there's a lot of disagreement in ethics, even if there were objective ethical truths. And finally, at the end of the day, maybe there are some objective moral principles, but then maybe individuals just tend to weigh them differently. So maybe two universal principles are things like we should respect the rights of individuals and not interfere with their rights. And maybe another objective moral principle is that we should try to maximize overall happiness and create the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. These both sound like reasonable principles, and you can find versions of these principles in almost every society that's ever existed. But sometimes these principles come into conflict, like with the taxation example again. Like, should we fund universal health care for everyone? If you're more focused on creating the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people, you'll probably say yes, if that principle is more important to you. If you're about respecting the rights of individuals and you're worried about taxing people and forcing them to pay for healthcare for others, then you might say no. And so then, even though we agree about the moral principles, maybe some people just disagree about which moral principle wins in that particular kind of case. Another consideration that I think drives a lot of people to find ethical relativism attractive, at least at first, is this idea of tolerance. So I'm going to lay this out in argument form. I don't think it always is expressed this precisely, but I think something like this idea is what makes relativism seem attractive. So we start with the idea that tolerance is a good thing, that it's good for us to be tolerant of other values and other cultures and respect cultural differences, and we admire people who have this kind of tolerance. And that seems reasonable, that seems like a good thing. And so some people, I think, kind of reason from there. Therefore, we should accept whichever moral theory most promotes tolerance. And it might seem to us that the theory that most promotes tolerance is ethical relativism, since it says that everyone gets to create their own morality, that no morality is better or worse than any other. And so then you might conclude that therefore we should be ethical relativists. So I think this has some intuitive appeal, but this kind of argument has some big problems. One big problem is that, of course, is such a thing as too much tolerance. there are some things that should not be tolerated. So we don't want the theory that most promotes tolerance. We want some tolerance, but we don't want tolerance of everything. We don't want tolerance of societies that are genocidal. We don't want tolerance of racism. We don't want tolerance of sexism and oppression of women. So there are some things that shouldn't be tolerated regardless of whether some society approves of them, or so this objection says. The second point is that you can be tolerant without being a relativist, at least to some degree. So I think a common confusion is some people will think that if you're trying to be objective about morality, if you're trying to say that there are universal, real moral truths, which means you're a realist about ethics, then that's going to make you intolerant. That's going to make you arrogant. That's going to make you judgmental. But I think the opposite is the truth. If you're a good moral realist, you ought to be humble. If you're a good moral realist, then that means that there are objective truths, and that means that you can make mistakes about them, just like anyone else. So that means you shouldn't always be judgmental of other cultures. It means you should be humble and recognize that other cultures might have some moral insights that you and your culture have missed out on. And that humility and that recognition of your own fallibility, that itself can promote a kind of moral tolerance. We want to understand and tolerate other cultures, at least to a degree, so that we can try to learn from them. And then a third important point to make here is that actually it's a confusion to say that ethical relativism promotes tolerance. Ethical relativism does not actually promote tolerance by itself. It would not say that it's a good thing for everyone to be tolerant. Instead, it would say you should only be tolerant if your society happens to value tolerance. Some societies do not value tolerance. Some societies promote intolerance. Some societies say the right thing to do is to crush and destroy and conquer other cultures. If you are a person in that kind of culture, then according to ethical relativism, it would actually be unethical for you to be tolerant. So if you want to say that everyone, regardless of what their culture says, ought to practice some degree of tolerance, you can't be a moral relativist. You actually have to be a moral realist. Okay, those are two of the major considerations in favor of ethical relativism. In the next lecture, we'll look at some of the big objections and problems with this moral theory.